In 3, 2, 1.
Hi, good evening, everybody. This is Get Ahead in English for the Bridgewater and Taunton College Trust. And in today's English Key Stage 4 session, we're going to be looking at AQA GCSE English Language Paper 2. And we're going to try and do a little bit of everything on this paper. So I know previous videos have guided you through, and I've run one actually, guiding you through question 4, for example, or question 2, and certainly question 5. But we're going to try and do a little bit of everything in the next 45 minutes to an hour. We are live. You may not be listening to this live, but I am recording this just a few days before this exam for year 11. So if you are online and you'd like to answer a question or ask a question, or anything at all, then please feel free to type into the chat window your questions, because we have a producer, Olivia, who will read the questions for me and I'll endeavour to answer them. You might hear some noise in the background once or twice, and that belongs to my children who are in the next room. So enjoy that. If they chime in, then that's the story behind it. Anyway, nice to see you again. Those of you who do regularly attend, I've had a break while Emily has taken over. And I'm James Harper, Head of English at West Somerset, and this is my first of the final term. So, as I say, we're going to do a Language Paper 2 walkthrough for AQA Exam Board. And all it's going to be is me guiding you through each question, the whole paper to begin with, giving you some advice, top tips, timings, that sort of thing. Excuse me. And then what we'll do is we'll move on to some more specific guidance for each question. So hopefully this will be useful. You might find that it's almost too much or it's too quick, but then you can pause it, you can revisit it. And if you are attending live, you can ask me a question or maybe your own teachers at a future time. There's no, I think you probably all realise there's no one way to answer English exams. There are multiple different ways. So although tonight I'm not going to talk about things like Da Forest and some of the acronyms that have been taught in previous videos, I am going to cover the same sort of content and with the same desired goal, which is to get the best marks possible. All right, so here's a quick do now, as we like to say, and I will stay quiet for this. So I'll give you 60 seconds. It'd be interesting to know what you already know and remember about the structure and the requirements of this paper. So if you can just jot down on a piece of paper, maybe question 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Tell me how many marks each question is worth. Tell me what the question's asking you to do, and maybe how many minutes you'd spend on each of those questions. So I do myself a little timer for 1 minute and give you the time to do that. Thank you. My children have been told to behave like ninjas and to be super quiet, but they have failed. 30 seconds. 30 seconds left. Give it 10 seconds and we'll compare our answers. Okay, so this is an activity that I've done with my groups, and it's always interesting because although we've talked about these exams now for quite a long time, if you're in year 11, certainly, what students tend to do is become overwhelmed. There's so many different things going on. They've got other subjects, of course, as well that take their time, their attention, and English teachers maybe sometimes forget that. But what we end up with is everything kind of blurry into one a bit. and going into panic mode. So what we want really is for students to be confident that they know what's coming up, they know what is an absolute certainty, like the wordings of questions, for example, and what might be a little bit more unpredictable. So you've probably got something similar to this, one would hope. So question 1 in this paper is true or false, and is worth 4 marks, and you should spend, well, 4 marks to 4 minutes or 5 minutes at most, but if you can save yourself some time on this question, it's probably worth doing. Question 2 is summarize and infer, and we'll start looking at that in a moment. So you compare one aspect of the 2 sources, and that's 8 marks. How is language used? One paragraph, and your one paragraph is analysed, and you write maybe 2 to 3 points, 12 marks for that question. Question 4, compare the writer's attitudes and perspectives, 16 marks. And then question 5, which I haven't put on this slide, that's irritating of me, is to write an article, letter, speech, or the text for a leaflet. And that is your big question 5 writing task. It's worth 24 marks for content and organisation, and it's worth 16 marks for technical accuracy. So things like spelling, punctuation, and grammar. And at 40 marks, we do need to be spending 40 to 45 minutes on that question to make sure we do it justice. So one rule of thumb is to say, okay, it's worth 4 marks and I spend 4 minutes on it. And that will give you a bit of luxury to go back and check things or to add things, particularly on the bigger questions. All right, so it's always nice to see the paper, and if I were your teacher, I'd have it in front of you, printed or under a visualizer. The best I can do on these sessions really is to provide it for you on the PowerPoint. So I've taken screenshots and I literally want to show you the paper. So this is the 2019 paper. It's also the paper we're going to be looking at in terms of our practice work this evening. So you can see that paper 2 is called Writers' Viewpoints and Perspectives. It's a non-fiction paper, and this is the November resit for 2019. Time allowed will be 1 hour and 45 minutes for certain, and there's information lower down. I expect you can't see my cursor, but I'm wandering around the information section now. 40 marks for section A, 40 marks for section B, reminded of the need for good English and clear presentation in your answers. All right, so all of that's really important. I'm an examiner for AQA, and I mark the language paper, paper 1, and handwriting, although it's not necessarily, doesn't need to be absolutely immaculate, we need to try and make our writing legible so that examiners have an easy job and credit you for the things you've done. Sometimes it's hard to read handwriting. So without going into any detail of the questions yet, this is the paper. So section A, if you decide to start with section A, reading, you have 2 sources. We'll look at those in a moment. And it will always ask you to do the same thing here, which is to read again, probably the first paragraph of source A, although they could choose anything. It will tell you which lines to look at, and it will ask you to shade in the circles of the boxes that you think are true. There's 8 statements, 4 are true, 4 are false, and you are to circle or shade 4 of those boxes only. All right, and they will credit you for however many you get right. All right, there are normally 1 or 2 that feel like they're there to trick you or trip you up. So just read carefully, but don't spend too long on this. Try and guarantee yourself the 4 marks and then move on. Question 2 is a comparison. Although it doesn't use the word comparison, you will be required to compare because of the identification of the words similar or different. All right, so you use details from both of the extracts and you write a summary of what you understand about a specific focus. All right, this is a tricky question because of the time that you have, 8 to 10 minutes, but it is comprehension and it is something you've been practicing for a long time. So it's not tricky, but it is important that you read between the lines and don't just write in your own words a kind of a commentary. We'll look at this question again later. So I think you have two sides of lined booklet for that, but I haven't included all of those. So question 3 guides you towards a specific part of either source A or source B, and it will be a paragraph that is rich in similes or metaphors. It will probably include things like lists or repetition. It may include alliteration or sibilance. You might find an oxymoron or onomatopoeia. And all of those are the good stuff that we need to be looking at, identifying, quoting, and explaining the effects. So this is a good old-fashioned language analysis question. It's exactly the same as if you remember paper 1 question 2, except here it's worth 12 marks and it requires maybe 1 extra point. So we're looking at maybe 4 images or 4 quotations that you can dive into, and I'll explain my methods in a moment. All right, so there you have question 3. For question 4, this is a tricky question because it requires you to compare both for language and for structure, and also for the writer's attitudes and or perspective. So the good thing about it is the focus is fairly narrow, and you will be used to, if you do the questions in order, you'll be used to what's going on by the time you get to this question, but it does need 20 minutes, I think. 16 minutes, 16 marks feels a little bit mean for this question, so between 16 and 20 minutes works for me. All right, so we'll have a look at ways in which you can approach this question later on. And then question 5 is writing. It's section B, a completely separate section worth the same number of marks as all of section A put together. And you are asked to write an article, letter, speech, or the text for a leaflet, which has never come up, but I suppose could. I don't want anyone complaining that we've said text for a leaflet won't come up, and it does. And we'll have a look maybe at those different options if we have time at the end of this session. So it's worth 40 marks. You're advised to plan. Hopefully your teachers have given you some tips already, but I'll give you mine, and you can work on practicing for that question. Okay, so a little bit of reading for us to do now. If I'm going too quickly, by the way, feel free to pause, rewind, go back. Your job here now for the next 5 minutes or so is just to read with me. So we're going to look at the inserts that you get given in paper 2, and that is a little booklet, normally just a couple of pages long, 1 page for source A and 1 for source B. Sometimes it spills over, like in this example, but it won't be that long. It is true that you've got more reading to do in paper 2 than you have in paper 1. In some ways, it's a tougher exam because you're juggling those 2 sources. Although question 3's 12 marks for a short piece of kind of analysis in some ways makes up for it. So you're given quite interesting information already on the front page, which might be worth highlighting. So we know that source A is 20th century. It will either be 20th or 21st century. And here it's called literary non-fiction, meaning that it's not like a newspaper article or a magazine article. It's been written like a journal or a memoir autobiography. Here it's an essay by a very famous writer, George Orwell, you may have heard of. 1936, it's called Shooting an Elephant. So there's already interesting and important information you're given right on there at the front, on the front cover. And then source B is 19th century, will always be 19th century, non-fiction, general, but we're told it's an extract from a book by somebody called Abraham Bartlett, published in 1898. There's not that big a gap between them, but you don't get marks for identifying one's 20th century and one's 19th century. Okay, so just bear in mind that they are kind of 50 years apart, but they're similar in terms of their form and genre, and their subject matter, of course, will be linked too. So they're both about elephants. If you want to see these sources in your own time, there's a really nice website that I found on that link there, or the QR code below it, which gives you a bank of all the paper 2 questions from not only from that were past exams, but also some practice papers. It's really nice. I use it all the time. You can download all the question papers and the inserts. And if you need a mark scheme for the question paper, then ask your teachers, because they're bound to be able to access it. Okay. So let's read together then. So this is source A. One of the things that I would suggest you did as you're reading is have the questions in mind. So although I'm going to look at the questions after I've read, I would expect you to know what the question's focus is so that you read purposefully. All right. So, you know, students love in English having a highlighter, and they like making notes and underlining things. And that's all great. But here you've got a very specific focus, and you're reading with purpose from the get-go. Okay. If you've got 15 minutes reading time, really. If you want to cut that down to 10 minutes, then that's fine, but I wouldn't cut it any less than 10 minutes. So understanding what you're reading is key, but also having an idea of what you're going to be comparing, summarizing, and which paragraph is the one that you're going to be delving deeper into for analysis as well. Look at that little box at the top. There's interesting and useful information there. George Orwell was a young British writer who started work in 1922 as a policeman in Burma. At that time, Burma was part of the British Empire. The extract is from his essay Shooting an Elephant, which he wrote in 1936. Okay, so we are comparing, just for your information, for question 2, we are comparing, let's go back to the question, the ways the elephants behave. You might want to highlight for that. We are looking at the paragraph on line 26. I'll flag it up when we get to it, for the language used to describe the crowd. And then for question 4, the big one, we're comparing the attitudes of the writers to the elephants themselves. Okay. Early one morning, the sub-inspector at another police station the other end of town rang me up on the phone and said that an elephant was ravaging the bazaar. Will I please come and do something about it? I did not know what I could do, but I wanted to see what was happening, and I started out. I took my rifle, much too small to kill an elephant, but I thought the noise might be useful. It was not, of course, a wild elephant, but a tame one. It had been chained up, but on the previous night it had broken its chain and escaped. In the morning, the elephants had suddenly reappeared in the town. It had already destroyed somebody's bamboo hut, killed a cow, and raided some fruit stalls and devoured the stock. Some Burmese men arrived and told us that the elephant was in the paddy fields below, only a few hundred yards away. I sent an orderly to borrow an elephant rifle. The orderly came back in a few minutes with a rifle and 5 cartridges. As I started forward, practically the whole population of the area flocked out of their houses and followed me. They had seen the rifle and were all shouting excitedly that I was going to shoot the elephant. It made me vaguely uneasy. I had no intention of shooting the elephant. I marched down the hill, looking and feeling a fool, with a rifle over my shoulder and an ever-growing army of people jostling at my heels. At the bottom, the elephant was standing 80 yards from the road. He took not the slightest notice of the crowd's approach. He was tearing up bunches of grass, beating them against his knees to clean them, and stuffing them into his mouth. As soon as I saw the elephant, I knew with perfect certainty that I ought not to shoot him. It is a serious matter to shoot a working elephant. It is comparable to destroying a huge and costly piece of machinery. And at that distance, peacefully eating, the elephant looked no more dangerous than a cow. I decided that I would watch him for a while to make sure he did not turn savage again, and then go home. But at that moment, I glanced around at the crowd that had followed me. It was an immense crowd. This is the paragraph for close analysis, okay? It was an immense crowd, 2,000 at the least, and growing every minute. I looked at the sea of faces above the garish clothes, faces all happy and excited over this bit of fun, all certain that the elephant was going to be shot. They were watching me as they would watch a conjurer about to perform a trick. And suddenly I realized that I should have to shoot the elephant after all. The people expected it of me, and I had got to do it. Here was I, the white man with his gun, seemingly the leading actor of the piece, but in reality I was only a puppet pushed to and fro by the will of those faces behind. To come all that way, rifle in hand, with 2,000 people marching at my heels, and then to trail feebly away, having done nothing, no, that was impossible. The crowd would laugh at me. But I did not want to shoot the elephant. It seemed to me that it would be murder to shoot him. Somehow, it always seems worse to kill a large animal. It was perfectly clear to me what I ought to do. I ought to walk up to the elephant and test his behaviour. If he charged, I could shoot. If he took no notice of me, it would be safe to leave him. But I also knew I was going to do no such thing. If the elephant charged and I missed him, I should have about as much chance as a toad under a steamroller. The sole thought in my mind was that if anything went wrong, those 2,000 Burmese people would see me pursued, caught, and trampled on. And if that happened, it was quite probable that some of them would laugh. That would never do. There was only one alternative. It's quite nice to train your voice to read a piece like that. It doesn't feel that dissimilar to fiction, does it? So you can hear the repetition of I. It's very personal. It's about his feelings. And I think sometimes if you just read without that voice in your head, you don't get that. And so that's something to maybe work on. If you're in year 10, for example, watching this, then, you know, that's something that you can still work on. So there's your first source, source A, shooting an elephant. You get the gist of it. Let's do the reading for source B. Slightly shorter. It's from a book called Wild Animals in Captivity, published in 1898 by Abraham Bartlett, who was head keeper at the Zoological Society of Gardens, now London Zoo. Here we go. Similar deal, all right? Making notes on the questions that you know are comparison 2 and 4. Here you're looking for the summary of the elephant's behaviour, and you're also thinking about the writer's perspectives on elephants. The first elephant that ever came under my charge was the celebrated Jumbo. The African elephant was received at the Zoological Gardens in exchange for other animals on June the 26th, 1863. At that date, Jumbo was about 4 foot high and he was in filthy and miserable condition. I handed him over to keeper Matthew Scott. The first thing we did was to remove the filth and dirt from his skin. This was a task requiring a great deal of labour and patience. The poor beast's feet had grown out of shape, but by scraping and rasping, together with a supply of good food, his condition rapidly improved. However, he soon began to play some very lively tricks, so much so that we found it necessary to put a stop to his games, and this we did in a very speedy and effectual manner. Scott and myself, holding him by each ear, gave him a good thrashing. He quickly recognised that he was mastered by lying down and uttering a cry of submission. We coaxed him and fed him with a few tempting treats, and after this time he appeared to recognise that we were his best friends, and he continued on the best of terms with both of us until the year before he was sold. He was at that time about 21 years old and had gained the enormous size of 11 foot in height. All male elephants at this age become troublesome and dangerous. Jumbo was no exception to this rule. He began to destroy the doors and other parts of his house, driving his tusks through the iron plates, splintering the timbers in all directions. When in this condition and in his home, none of the other keepers except Scott dare go near him. Strange to say, he was perfectly quiet as soon as he was allowed to be free in the gardens. I was perfectly aware that this restless and frantic condition could be calmed by reducing the quantity of his food, fastening his limbs by chains, and an occasional flogging. But this treatment would have called forth a multitude of protests from kind-hearted and sensitive people, and would have led to those keepers concerned appearing before the magistrates' police court charged with cruelty. It is only those who have had experience in the management of an elephant who are aware that unless the person in charge of him is determined to be master and overpower him, that person will lose all control over him and will be likely to fall victim to his enormous strength. But to return to Jumbo's early days, he was very soon strong enough to carry children on his back, and therefore a new saddle was made for him. At that time, all the cash handed to the keepers of the elephants by the people who rode on them was the keepers to keep. How much they received from the visitors will probably never be known, but as Jumbo became the great favourite, Scots came in for the lion's share. Jumbo had been for nearly 16 years quiet, gentle and obedient, and had daily carried hundreds of visitors about the gardens. Finding that at the end of that period he was likely to do some fatal mischief, I made an application to the council to be supplied with a powerful enough rifle in the event of finding it necessary to kill him. About this time, I received a letter from Mr. Barnum asking if the Zoological Society would sell the big African elephant and at what price. I wrote immediately to Mr. Barnum, telling him that he could have Jumbo for £2,000. Okay, so I hope you didn't mind me reading those to you. Obviously, in the exam, you will have up to 15 minutes reading time. Up to you how you manage it. I would probably read relatively quickly through both. Once, get the gist, make a couple of notes about what happens in each section, divide it up, and then read again with the questions in mind and a highlighter in hand so that you're starting to drill into the sort of detail you need. Then I would go with question 1, true or false, and go for that question, do it quickly. So 4 true, 4 false statements, shade the boxes for true, 4 minutes, no excuses I put. I think tough love there. You don't want to mess up, but equally don't want to spend too long on a question that is only worth 4 out of 160 marks really over the 2 papers. Okay, so it's a game. You need to play the game, and this bit is to be done relatively quickly. So let's move on. There are the statements. Pause the screen if you want and select the 4. You're welcome to do that, or you can download the question paper on the website that I showed you. So let's look at question 2 in a bit more detail. So this is an 8-mark question, and feels like sometimes it should be worth more than 8 marks because it asks you to do quite a lot. So you are asked to summarize the differences or similarities or both, because it doesn't really matter, between the 2 texts. In order to achieve a good mark, you must infer beyond the obvious and read between the lines. Look at the question wording. Both sources describe how the elephants behave. Use details from both sources to write a summary of what you understand about the similar behavior of the elephants. Okay, so we're talking about elephants' behavior, highlight that, and we're asked to write a summary, you'll always be asked to write that, of their similar behavior. All right, so we're looking for similarities, but actually you will be marked for differences as well if you find those. There's another word that's sometimes ignored, which is understand about, because you aren't just going to put things in your own words. That's the trigger, that's the cue to show you have to infer meaning. All right, I'll show you an example. There's your, the first thing to do, highlight the focus. And this is the planning structure that I've been using with my groups. So you find the key or a key similarity or difference between the 2. Here we're asked for similarities. And so I will be looking at how the elephant's behavior is similar in source A and source B. All right, and I would have some evidence to back that up. Okay, The top row then becomes the opening sentence of your response, like an introduction, but won't carry many marks on its own. And then you work across the rows to show the differences or similarities. The table helps you keep you focused. It'll take you 10 seconds to draw it up, but I think it's worth it. You don't have to draw a table, but the table might help you. So, for example, here, if we look at this, I'll show you that answer in a second, sorry. These kinds of trigger words and verbs are useful to remember for this question, so just bung them in. This might imply or suggest, however, we might conclude an inference, or one way of reading this is, that's not analysing language. So this is a question that doesn't require you to identify similes or metaphors, or even zoom into individual word choices. Although you could do that, you're not actually getting marks for it unless it helps support the point you're making, which is the meaning behind what is said. All right, so I'll show you what we mean. So this is my answer to question 2. It's slightly longer than it needs to be. Let me read it to you. So that first bullet point, by the way, you don't use bullet points in the exam, just write them as paragraphs, is the top line of that table. So there's your table. One key similarity or difference is, in both sources, the elephant's behavior is as a result of their captivity and desperation to escape and find a degree of freedom. Okay, so that opening sentence establishes to the examiner that you know what you're doing, that you've got one angle. There's no right or wrong answer, but that is a clear link. In A, notice how I'm not using extra words that I don't need to. Orwell tells us that this supposedly tame elephant had broken its chain and escaped. See, I'm using quotations embedded, really just as a way to show that the evidence is there. You could use your own words as well. I've seen 8 marks given to students who don't use quotations for this, but my advice is still to use quotes because it will allow you to show off a skill, which is marked for. Anyway, this suggests that elephants cannot be easily tamed, and their natural instinct to be free will result in behaviour that might be considered aggressive. In B, Bartlett tells us that the captive elephant began to play some very lively tricks on its reception at the zoo. The writer suggests the zookeepers are concerned and give it a good thrashing rather than take a rifle to it. This is cruel but effective, as Jumbo lies down and utters a cry of submission, suggesting unhappy compliance. All right, so there's the similar behaviour, but with some differences thrown in for the good measure. In A, the elephant destroyed somebody's bamboo hut, killed a cow, raided some fruit stalls. These behaviours seem to show the elephant has no regard for anyone but itself, although we might say it's acting on instinct. It's acting elephant. Similarly, in B, the elephant destroys the door and other parts of his house. Although this is the elephant's own house, he is clearly not respectful of it. In A, the elephant is undisturbed by the approaching crowd. It took not the slightest notice, tearing up bunches of grass. Again, it behaves in a way an elephant might in the wild. In B, the elephant's behavior improves when he was allowed to be free in the gardens, and some element of freedom provides sanctuary. So an answer like that is quite long, and I would be giving that 6 or 7 out of 8. I might want to see the student tying their ideas together a little more, and actually you don't need to write any more to do that. So you might look, for example, at the behavior of both elephants being within the species natural kind of behavior, and go back to that introduction in a way that introduction could be returned to. But it's a good answer. And it's a sort of answer that most of you out there will be able to emulate in the exam for very good marks. Okay, so we're going to move on, otherwise we'll run out of time. Question 3. So question 3, remember, is language analysis of a specific passage that you will be guided towards in the exam booklet. Now for paper 1, they very kindly reproduced the paragraph and put it on the page, but certainly in recent exams, for paper 2, they don't do that. So you just need to be careful that you are selecting the right piece, the right source. I've seen lots of students pick the wrong source and answer on, potentially get 0 marks for that. So 12 marks rather than 8. Analyze language from a short extract, 12 to 15 minutes. Select 4 diveable images that you should be able to say 3 things about. Okay, so my advice always here is to write as much as you possibly can, only selecting only the quotes that give you that luxury, if you like. So quotes that are similes or metaphors or personification examples tend to be the best because they will give you maybe 3 different things to say. What does the simile suggest? Saying it's a simile on its own is worth a mark potentially. Thinking about how the choice of language there has an effect on the reader or on the tone of the piece and so on. So for each image that you highlight, you should be able to say what the idea is being presented, how the writer achieves this presentation, and why this is effective. And if those are the 3 things you say about each quote, then that's really, really good. Okay. For this question, 12 to 15 minutes is not long, but if you do have time, just like we did with the introduction to question 2, it's useful to sum it up with a big picture idea in the first sentence, like a very mini introduction. So this is not an example for the paper we're looking at tonight, but an example of that might be from the language the writer uses. It is immediately clear that the environment is hostile and dangerous. So hostile, dangerous are going to be your kind of drive words here that you're going to then explore through the quotations you've selected. So you start quite quickly there, keep a clear focus, and then you can just jump straight into your quote. So I'm suggesting that you pick maybe 4 maximum quotations here to get a really good mark. And you write it up in maybe 3 paragraphs. You could do 1 paragraph per quote. You could do 2 longer paragraphs and split it that way. And the sort of language stem that you need, the sense of X, is further reinforced by this. The writer continues the sense of through whatever, further explored, developing motif. All right, so examiners love when students write about things like symbols and motifs, and those big picture metaphors as well, that really carry good marks. So if we just plan together this one really quickly, how does the writer use language to describe the crowd of people? Sharp focus on the crowd of people, can be about the reaction as well. 12 marks. So let's just take a couple of things out of this together. Here's the paragraph again. I won't read it to you again. Give my voice a break and give yourself 60 seconds to pick out your best 3 quotes for this. Okay, our time 60 seconds now, and there won't be any sound from me. In 20 seconds. When my children come upstairs from the bath, you're going to hear maybe a bit of screaming, a bit of atmosphere. It doesn't do any harm. I should go and help, but here I am. Right, okay, done. What are your 3 quotes here? The crowd of people. You might have chosen words like immense and maybe the number to go with it, 2,000 at the least and growing every minute. You might consider that to be hyperbolic, a bit exaggerated. Certainly 2,000 feels like a large number, so the number's used there to emphasize size. Very common for students to select here the sea of faces as a metaphor. And then I would want you to talk about what the idea behind sea means for you. Overwhelming, everything blurs into one. again to do with size, those sorts of ideas, the effect on the reader is, we share this sense of trepidation maybe. Then you got simile. They were watching me as they would a conjurer about to perform a trick. That simile there is worth having in your answer here. The crowd of people are hanging on his move. He feels the pressure. The simile works on multiple levels. What's the trick he's going to perform? He's going to shoot the elephant. That's what they're waiting to see. But we know, don't we, that there's doubts. Using a metaphor later on about being the leading actor might come into that, or even the puppet pushed to and fro. All of those ideas about make-believe. So can you see how you might get to move up to 12 marks by linking the quotes together? It's a semantic field connected to faking things, being a fraud, an actor rather than somebody in playing a real part. So he feels dislocated. The crowd, we've got to answer about the crowd of people. So you keep steering it back to the crowd. And then I think maybe you might finish with something like that last sentence. The crowd would laugh at me. He effectively feels judged, isolated. The spotlight's very much on him. If you get stuck on this question, my advice is to think, well, here's the phrase you might want, but what other words might have been chosen in maybe a piece that is less complex, perhaps, but that doesn't use lots of similes and metaphors? What's the effect of the simile or metaphor as opposed to something that's a little bit more literal? Here's an example answer that gets 10 out of 12, so it doesn't get full marks, but does the right sorts of things. I'm not going to read it to you, but if I leave it on the screen, you see in yellow there are methods. We could argue about visualize, but effectively it's about imagery here. And in green, I've highlighted the meanings that are created through the methods used. I could have highlighted the quotes in another color as well, but if you see, this paragraph is basically very deep analysis of just one quote, Sea of Faces. And I use this one to show you exactly how writing a lot about a little is going to give you the best marks. And this then goes on. This is the final bit of the answer. Juxtaposition, contrast, similes, sense of frustration, all methods, opposition. We've got quotations, and then we've also got the joy and the pleasure in a tragic event. So it's element of contrast. It's a good, really good answer that gets a very decent mark. So let's finish with the reading section anyway now with a quick reminder of question 4. So this is a 16-mark question. And deserves that time, 16 minutes at least. You compare the different or similar viewpoints of two writers. Okay, they tend to be different, and they might use a different words to viewpoints. So in past exams, they've also used thoughts, ideas, perspectives, attitudes, feelings, and opinions. But to be honest with you, they're very grey distinctions. You are asked about the views or perspectives of two writers on a similar topic or the same topic. And I like a grid for this one as well. And I've done this in a previous video for the whole hour. So if you want to look back through this year's Get Ahead videos, you will find one where I do this in detail. So I won't spend as long as I normally would. What you should do as you're reading is, for this question, you should have the one most important or key similarity or difference that you see. So this question is about their views on elephants. Now, there's lots you could do with this, but you might get into a big old tangle if you try and do everything. So as I was reading, I was thinking, what are the key differences between their views on elephants? And the one I've gone with for the practice here is that Orwell thinks practically and with some degree of sympathy for the elephant, that he treats the elephant with a degree of respect. Although actually the pressure of the crowd and the way he feels in front of all these people ends up dominating his thoughts. Whereas in B, effectively the elephant is a source of income for the zoo, and if the elephant's poorly behaved, it needs to be punished in order for it to continue to be lucrative. So that was the one I went with. There are others though. For example, Orwell doesn't know anything about elephants, or doesn't seem to, whereas whether we like what Bartlett does or not, he sounds like an expert. He treats the elephant cruelly, but his perspective comes from a place of expertise, and we might not approve of that in 2023, but in 1898, at least he makes it sound like this was normal. So what I want you to do for this question is I want you to focus yourself on the one or at most two key differences. All right. And then you write your three images into the table. All right. So image one, image two, image three. I've got this for the elephant, so we'll look at that in a moment. And as you plan this out, you ask yourself, why has the writer selected this image? It doesn't have to be an image, it could be a different method, but imagery often works best. What does it tell us about the writer's thoughts and emotional reaction? And why this word or phrase and not another one? These are always things that will help. And then as you write your answer up, you've got a sentence at the start, and then you move from A through to B, so you're comparing directly, and so on until you finish that's three chunky paragraphs, really, for 16 to 20 marks. As is always the case, depth trumps breadth, meaning I'd like you to focus on one similarity. You don't have to focus on a range. So one difference or similarity rather than five. You won't finish, you just won't finish, and therefore you probably could have written in more depth about one. And that's my strong advice here. You could do the grid twice if you've got time. If you're really speedy and you've read well, then you could. But one should be enough if you do it in enough detail. So here was the question that accompanied the insert. It's compare how the writers convey their different attitudes to the elephants. And all the rest, all the bullet points are useful. They are the same in every exam. So highlighting words, often as an examiner, I see students who cross out the word could and write the word should or must, thinking that that's going to help them. I don't know if that's the sort of thing that you should already know by now. So I've done this for you and with you. This will leave me with 10 minutes once I've done this, just to talk about question 5. So I wrote the bit in blue at the top as my introduction. So I've gone with a key difference between the writer's attitudes towards the elephants is that in A, Orwell is more considerate and believes the elephant should be treated with respect, though increasingly feels the pressure of public interest. In B, Bartlett is heartless and cruel, seeing the elephant only as a potential source of income. Should be a full stop there. Now, the more I think about it, the more there might be a more interesting or nuanced approach to that introduction, but it sets us up in an exam that's pretty strong. Okay, so now I think you should be able to see what we would do. We'd take an image from source A, or here I've got a series of 3 very similar statements that are subtly different. He starts by saying, Orwell says, I had no intention of shooting the elephant, quite emphatic. He then moves on to a slightly softer modal, ought not to shoot. And then by the halfway stage, but I did not want to shoot. It's as if his intention is softening. And by the end, it feels like he's going to shoot the elephant. He feels like there isn't much choice as he's surrounded. So I'll take those quotations and I'll look at repetition and I'll think about perspective and I'll think about the tone changing, and I will make sure that I use words like attitudes and elephants to make sure that we have that clearly in focus. Now, my advice to you is that you then move on to a source B image that does a similar or different thing. All right. I haven't planned it that way because that seems clunky to do it that way. So I did all of A in one go. All right. So now I've moved on to source A's second quote. It would be murder to shoot him. So in quite an emotive word. It always seems worse to kill a large animal. So what does that, or those pair of quotes give you? An emotional reaction, a reaction that comes from a place of maybe empathy. And I would want to drill into the tone there and the way in which the language is I guess it is murder. It feels like Orwell is really weighing up the moral dimensions of what he might be about to do. And then I would go with something like this, because by the end of the extract, surrounded by 2,000 people, we have, and also faced with an elephant that's either going to run him over and charge at him or get shot. That's the ultimatum. So we use words like this. 2,000 Burmese people would see me pursued, caught and trampled on. List of 3, tricolon. Some of them would laugh. So there's a kind of, again, an emotional connection here. That would never do. There was only one alternative. So in the end of the day, although Orwell does start off believing the elephant should be treated with respect, by the end of the extract, his position in human society as a white British man in colonial Burma, as horrific as all of that is that he needs to take control of the situation. All right, so I've got my A images, and you'll notice I have cheated and used more than one quotation for each row, but that's how I would plan. And then for source B, I've got different attitudes. So whereas Orwell doesn't want to shoot the elephant and says so, in B, Bartlett says he found it necessary to put a stop to his games, gave him a good thrashing. Language or like of kind of corporal punishment, language that feels archaic and feels kind of anti-welfare, and good thrashing for me also seems like it's a sort of language that's outdated, and so on. We've got calmed by reducing the quantity of his food, fastening his limbs by chains, occasional flogging, the language of cruelty, 3 different ideas. So this is also a tricolon, and perhaps becoming more and more cruel with each item in the list. So you could think about that. And then finally, the idea of a rifle recurs here. Fortunately, he doesn't have to shoot the elephant because somebody comes and buys it. Capitalism. I made an application, blah, 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 necessary to kill him, could have jumbo for £200. This is a man motivated by income at the end of the day rather than anything else. Okay, so there's your question 4 advice. I hope that's helpful. I hope there's something there you can take away. Don't overcomplicate it. Choose one really, really good link and sell it with 3 quotes. Just quickly, we haven't got much time, 5 minutes at most, but here's your question 5. Wasn't going to do a question 5 focus today anyway, but this was the task for question 5 in that exam. People protest about the cruelty of keeping animals in captivity, but they seem happy enough to eat meat, keep pets, and visit zoos. All animals should be free. Article for magazine in which you explain your point of view on this statement. So within the task, you will be told what the form is. You've got to write an article, what the purpose is, your point of view, and the audience. So those that might read magazines, so it needs to be relatively formal, but it doesn't have to be kind of a letter to an MP style. We want it to be engaging. All right. So if you get an article in your exam, generally speaking, it can be a little bit more relaxed, but you want to write and show your formal English skills. It could be one of the others, of course, and has been in the past. We've never had a leaflet, but who knows? here's my advice for this question. To achieve a good mark, you need to understand the form, purpose, and audience and reflect it in your writing. So how are you going to show the examiner that you are writing a magazine article? You might use subheadings, but the best way to do it is to not start with a silly statement like, I partly agree with this statement, or I was reading your magazine and I strongly disagree. Like, magazine articles are not written like that. Your journalist's tone might begin with, for example, my favorite is an anecdote. All right, so you begin with just last Thursday, or I remember a time when, and you take the reader back to a moment when zoos were important to you, or a visit to a zoo that shocked you, or inspired you. If you don't like that, a rhetorical question will work. I've read lots of other good ways of beginning, but you don't want to kind of have too many things straight away. So that's my suggestion for a hook. Then we go into a backward-looking topic sentence, which basically means the first sentence of the second paragraph looks back to what you've just talked about and brings it forward, okay? And that is going to get you marks for organization if it's done well. Logos, Aristotle, what's the issue? What's the problem? Why is it worth discussing? Maybe don't necessarily give your own point of view, but you could hint at it by this point, all right? Then pathos, which is an emotional connection. You might shock somebody with something. You might use another anecdote. You might think about, look forward to a future in which something might happen. Using ideas like family or children. I know it's a bit manipulative, but if we start to play on the reader's emotions here, that's what we're looking to do. Back to logos and offer a counter argument. But you reject it. So you say, some might say that zoos provide great scientific progress, but actually, and you reject it, but actually the cons outweigh the pros, and zoos around the world tend to be barbaric, hostile environments, blah, 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 so that you're kind of backing out of that argument. Then ethos, and ethos in layman's terms simply means offer a solution, show that you have either experienced or have thought about this deeply, and that's why your persona is important. You should be somebody who knows something about the topic. And then finally, a circular ending. So you go back to the start and your visit to the zoo as a child and how it's changed your life, and you've become a zoologist or a veterinarian or something whereby animals are now kind of a real focus for you. Add a new dimension or answer the rhetorical question that you might have set up as well. I wrote one, or I started to write one. I'll flash it up on the screen. I won't read it to you. But there's my first paragraph with an anecdote. It's a magazine, so I'm going to get away with using words like animal turds. Then I set up the dilemma, which is that zoos increasingly are being protested against. These aren't necessarily my opinions. I'm fairly on the fence about it, but this is the way that I would frame the argument. All right. And I haven't written the other bits, but we go into an emotional connection, counter argument, solution to the argument, back to my anecdote. 6 paragraphs feels pretty reasonable. 45 minutes could possibly take a little less. Right, I've come to the end of the hour and I've actually done the whole hour. If you've got any questions or comments, hopefully you've typed them in, and I'll try and get back to you in whatever way I can. I'll see you next time for a session on the Prelude by William Wordsworth, which for year 11 you won't have to do again. But I look forward to talking about that poem with you next Wednesday. Thanks very much indeed. Hi, Olivia. Hey, Olivia, I'm going to hang up now. Okay, bye.